The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Mercy's Bend as Eliza Whitmore stood before the weathered wooden doors of St. Catherine's Church, her wedding dress, a hand-me-down from her mother that had been hastily altered, felt like a shroud against her skin. The cream-colored fabric, yellowed with age, rustled in the desert wind that carried the scent of sage and distant rain. At 24, Eliza had already lived longer than most unmarried women in the territory without finding a husband. Her parents, Samuel and Margaret Whitmore, flanked her on either side, their faces set in grim satisfaction. They had finally managed to arrange what they considered a suitable match, or rather, any match at all, for their troublesome daughter. The groom, Cornelius Blackwell, stood at the altar with his back straight and his gray beard neatly trimmed. At 45, he was one of the wealthiest ranchers in the county, owning vast stretches of grazing land and more cattle than most men could count. That he had agreed to marry Eliza despite the whispered rumors about her condition had been considered nothing short of a miracle by her parents. Those rumors had started 3 years ago when Eliza's first engagement to a young clerk named Thomas had been mysteriously broken off. No one spoke openly about why, but in a town as small as Mercy's Bend, secrets had a way of growing legs and walking themselves from door to door. The word barren had attached itself to Eliza's name like a curse, following her through the mercantile, the church socials, and every public gathering. The church was nearly full, not out of celebration but curiosity. The good people of Mercy's Bend had turned out to witness what many privately called the impossible wedding. Women in their Sunday best whispered behind gloved hands, while men stood stiffly in their worn suits, stolen from work for this peculiar occasion. Eliza's hands trembled as she walked down the aisle, her father's grip on her arm firm enough to leave bruises. The bouquet of desert wildflowers she carried, gathered that morning in a desperate attempt to add beauty to this loveless union, was already wilting in the heat. Each step felt like walking toward a grave rather than an altar. Cornelius watched her approach with the same calculating look he used when appraising cattle at auction. There was no warmth in his pale blue eyes, only a cold satisfaction that he had acquired something others had passed over, likely at a bargain price. Eliza knew her parents had accepted a bride price far below what was customary, grateful that anyone would take their damaged goods off their hands. Reverend Josiah Mills stood ready with his worn Bible, his skeletal frame draped in black robes that had seen too many years of desert sun. He cleared his throat as Eliza reached the altar, preparing to begin the ceremony that would bind her to a man she barely knew and certainly didn't love. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his reedy voice carrying through the small church. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Cornelius Blackwell and Eliza Whitmore in holy matrimony." Eliza's mind drifted as the Reverend droned on about duty and submission. Through the church's single stained-glass window, she could see a hawk circling in the cloudless sky, free to go wherever the wind carried it. She envied that bird with a fierceness that surprised her. "Before we proceed," Cornelius suddenly spoke, his voice cutting through the Reverend's words like a knife. "There is a matter that must be addressed." The church fell silent. Eliza's heart began to pound as Cornelius turned to face the congregation, leaving her standing alone at the altar. "It has come to my attention," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed, "that certain information regarding my intended bride was withheld from me during our negotiations." Eliza's mother gasped softly. Her father's face flushed red above his collar. "I am a businessman," Cornelius continued, "and I do not appreciate being sold false goods. I was assured that Miss Whitmore was merely overlooked due to her willful nature. However, I have recently learned from a reliable source that she has been examined by Dr. Morrison and found to be incapable of bearing children." The whispers that erupted sounded like a nest of rattlesnakes stirring to life. Eliza stood frozen, her bouquet slipping from nerveless fingers to scatter across the floor. The humiliation she had thought herself prepared for crashed over her like a flash flood, threatening to sweep her away. "A woman who cannot bear children," Cornelius declared, turning back to look at Eliza with disgust. "Is as useless as a well gone dry. I will not bind myself to such a creature, no matter how desperate her family might be to rid themselves of her." He strode past Eliza without another glance, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. The congregation parted before him like the Red Sea, some faces showing shock, others barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing such a spectacular scandal. "Eliza," her mother hissed, grabbing her arm. "Say something. Tell him it's not true." But Eliza couldn't speak. The words stuck in her throat like desert thorns. It was true, Doctor. Morrison had examined her on her parents' insistence after Thomas broke their engagement. The old doctor, reeking of whiskey and judgment, had proclaimed her defective with the casual cruelty of someone discussing a lame horse. Her father released her arm as if she were suddenly contagious. "You stupid girl," he spat, his voice low but venomous. "Do you know what you've cost us? The shame you've brought on this family?" The Reverend cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps we should. That is, the church should be cleared." People began filing out, their excitement at witnessing such drama evident in their animated conversations. Eliza stood alone at the altar, abandoned by all, her wedding dress now feeling like a costume in a play where she had forgotten all her lines. "You're no daughter of mine," her father declared, loud enough for the lingering townspeople to hear. "Don't bother coming home. We have no place for a barren woman who brings nothing but shame." Her mother said nothing, merely following her husband out of the church, her shoulders rigid with mortification. They left Eliza standing there among the scattered wildflowers, their bright colors mocking against the dark wood floor, as the last of the congregation departed, eager to spread the tale of the jilted bride. Eliza finally moved. She walked slowly at first, then faster, pushing through the church doors into the blazing noon sun. The heat hit her like a physical blow, but she welcomed it. At least it was honest in its harshness. She had no plan, no destination, only the desperate need to be away from this place where her worth had been measured and found wanting. Her wedding shoes, impractical satin things her mother had insisted upon, began to tear within minutes of hitting the rough ground beyond the church. By the time she reached the edge of town, her feet were bleeding, leaving dark stains on the pale fabric. She stripped the shoes off and threw them into a patch of prickly pear cactus, taking grim satisfaction in the act of destruction. The dress would go too, she decided, as soon as she found something else to wear. The sun beat down mercilessly as Eliza walked, the road stretching endlessly before her. She had no water, no money, no prospects, but for the first time in months, she felt something other than resignation. It might have been desperation, or perhaps madness, but it felt strangely like freedom. Behind her, Mercy's Bend grew smaller, its buildings wavering in the heat like a mirage. Ahead lay the unknown, dangerous, certainly, probably fatal for a woman alone. But after what had just transpired, Eliza found she preferred the honest threats of the wilderness to the civilized cruelty she was leaving behind. She walked on, her bare feet finding their rhythm on the hard-packed earth, each step taking her further from the life that had rejected her and closer to whatever fate awaited her in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the New Mexico territory. The setting sun painted the red rock formations in shades of copper and gold as Colt McRae guided his horse along the narrow trail leading to his cabin. The day's work of scouting for the upcoming supply run had been uneventful, which suited him fine. In his line of work, uneventful meant alive. Behind him, a peculiar sight made him rein in his mount. A woman in a torn wedding dress stumbled along the desert road, her bare feet leaving bloody prints in the dust. Her auburn hair, once pinned in an elaborate style, now hung in wild disarray around her shoulders. She moved with the determined gait of someone running from something worse than the dangers ahead. Colt had seen enough desperate people to recognize one at a distance. He also knew that a woman alone in these parts, especially one clearly not prepared for the terrain, wouldn't last through the night. Coyotes were the least of the dangers waiting in the darkness. He turned his horse and rode back slowly, not wanting to startle her. The woman, Eliza, though he didn't know her name yet, looked up at the sound of hoofbeats. Her green eyes widened with fear before narrowing in defiance. She grabbed a rock, holding it like a weapon despite her obvious exhaustion. Colt stopped a safe distance away and dismounted. He held up both hands, showing he meant no harm, then pointed to his throat and shook his head. The gesture was one he'd perfected over the years, a simple way to explain what most people found unsettling about him. Eliza lowered the rock slightly, confusion replacing some of the fear in her expression. "You can't speak," he nodded, then gestured to her feet, bloodied and already swelling from the abuse of the desert floor. From his saddlebag, he pulled out a spare shirt and his water canteen, setting them on a flat rock between them before backing away. The woman stared at the offerings, then at him, clearly weighing her options. Pride warred with necessity in her face, a battle Colt had seen before. Necessity won. She limped forward, grabbed the water, and drank deeply. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice hoarse. She looked at the shirt, then down at her ruined dress. "If you'd turn around," Colt obliged, focusing on the distant mountains while fabric rustled behind him. When she cleared her throat, he turned back. His shirt hung loose on her frame, reaching nearly to her knees. But it was far more practical than the wedding dress now lying in tatters on the ground. He pointed to his horse, then to her, raising an eyebrow in question. She hesitated before nodding. "I suppose I don't have many choices, do I?" Colt helped her mount, noting how she winced but made no complaint. He swung up behind her, keeping a respectful distance while still ensuring she wouldn't fall. They rode in silence, which seemed to suit her as much as it did him. The cabin materialized from the landscape as if it had grown from the rocks themselves, built into a natural alcove in the cliffside. It was nearly invisible until you were almost upon it. Smoke drifted from the chimney, and a wolf-dog hybrid limped out to greet them, its scarred face and missing eye testament to hard living. "Easy, Buck." Colt signed to the dog, who recognized the hand signal and sat, though his one good eye remained fixed on the stranger. Eliza slid from the horse with obvious relief. "Is this your place?" Colt nodded, then helped her inside. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean, a single room with a bed, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, and shelves lined with supplies. Everything had its place, arranged with military precision. He gestured for her to sit, then knelt by her feet with a basin of water and clean cloth. Eliza watched warily as he began cleaning her wounds, his touch surprisingly gentle for such large, scarred hands. "I'm Eliza," she said suddenly, as if the silence had become too heavy. "Eliza Whitmore, or I was. Anyway, I don't suppose that name means much now." Colt looked up briefly, then returned to his task. He'd already guessed parts of her story. The wedding dress told its own tale. In his experience, women didn't flee in their wedding finery unless something had gone very wrong. After bandaging her feet, he stood and moved to the stove. Soon the smell of beans and salt pork filled the small space. He set a plate before her, along with a cup of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Eliza ate like she hadn't seen food in days, though Colt suspected it had more to do with emotional exhaustion than physical hunger. When she finished, she looked around the cabin with curious eyes. "Do you live here alone?" He nodded, then pointed to a piece of paper and charcoal on the table. "Sometimes, when necessary." He wrote to communicate, but Eliza shook her head. "It's fine. The silence is peaceful. Actually," she gave a bitter laugh, "better than the words I left behind." Colt understood that sentiment better than most. He'd chosen silence, in a way. After his vocal cords were damaged, the doctor said he might have regained some speech with effort, but Colt found he had little left worth saying. As night fell, he made a bed on the floor with his bedroll, gesturing for her to take the bed. Eliza protested weakly, but was too exhausted to argue long. Within minutes of lying down, she was asleep. Colt sat by the dying fire. Buck curled at his feet and considered the complication that had wandered into his carefully ordered life. He should take her to the nearest town tomorrow, Leave her at the hotel with enough money for a stage ticket to somewhere else. It was the sensible thing to do. But something in her eyes, that mix of defiance and devastation, reminded him of his own reflection in the days after he'd lost everything. She'd been broken by someone, cast out like he had been. The difference was, she hadn't chosen her silence. The next morning, Eliza woke to find fresh biscuits and honey on the table, along with a note in careful handwriting. "Stay as long as you need. There's work if you want it." She looked up to find Colt watching her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Work." He gestured around the cabin, which, while clean, showed the signs of bachelor living. Then he pointed to the garden plot outside, overrun with weeds, and the smokehouse that clearly hadn't been properly maintained in months. "You want me to be your housekeeper?" There was no offense in her tone, only practical consideration. He shrugged, then wrote, "Fair trade, food and shelter for help around the place. No questions asked." Eliza read the note twice. No questions asked. After yesterday's public humiliation, those might have been the most beautiful words she'd ever seen. "All right," she said simply. "I accept." And so began an arrangement that surprised them both in its ease. Eliza threw herself into the work with an energy that spoke of a need to stay busy, to not think. She cleaned and organized the cabin, tended the neglected garden, and proved to be an excellent cook with the simple ingredients available. Colt, for his part, maintained a respectful distance while ensuring she had everything she needed. He brought back fabric from town so she could make proper clothes, along with boots that actually fit her healing feet. He never asked about the wedding dress, which she had burned their second night there. They developed a rhythm of communication without words, a gesture here, a look there, the occasional written note when necessary. Eliza found herself relaxing into the quiet, discovering that Colt's silence wasn't empty, but rather full of unspoken understanding. Buck warmed to her quickly, often following her around as she worked. The old wolf dog had a pronounced limp from some long-ago injury, and Eliza found herself relating to the creature's survival despite its wounds. One evening, about 2 weeks into their arrangement, Eliza sat darning one of Colt's shirts while he cleaned his rifles. The domestic scene might have been laughable given their circumstances, a runaway bride and a mute gunslinger playing house in the middle of nowhere. "I know you won't ask," she said suddenly, her needle pausing mid-stitch, "but I want to tell someone about what happened." Colt looked up but didn't stop his maintenance of the weapons. His eyes, dark and patient, encouraged her to continue. "I was declared barren," she said, the word falling like a stone between them. "The doctor said I could never have children. My first fiancé left me because of it, and my parents, they tried to marry me off to anyone who would take damaged goods." Her hands had started trembling. She set down the sewing before she pricked herself. "Cornelius Blackwell agreed to marry me, but someone told him the truth right before the ceremony. He denounced me in front of the whole town, called me useless as a dry well." Colt's hands had stilled on the rifle. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble. "My parents disowned me on the spot," Eliza continued, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. "Said I was no daughter of theirs, so I walked away, and here I am." She wiped her face with her sleeve, frustrated by the show of weakness. But when she looked up, Colt had set aside the rifle and was holding out a clean handkerchief. His eyes held no pity, which she was grateful for, only a deep understanding that suggested he knew something about being cast out. That night, as she lay in bed listening to Colt's steady breathing from his bedroll by the fire, Eliza felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness, exactly, but an absence of the constant weight that had pressed on her chest since that first devastating diagnosis. Here, in this simple cabin, with a man who couldn't speak and a broken dog, she had found something she'd never had in Mercy's Bend with all its proper society and cruel judgments. She'd found a place where her worth wasn't measured by her womb, where her value wasn't determined by what she could produce for a husband. She'd found refuge, and maybe, just maybe, A chance to discover who Eliza Whitmore was when she wasn't defined by what she lacked. The sandstorm hit without warning on a late October evening. Eliza had been tending the small fire outside, preparing to smoke some venison Colt had brought back, when the western sky turned an ominous brown. Within minutes, the wind picked up, carrying with it a wall of sand that blotted out the setting sun. Colt appeared from nowhere, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the rocky outcropping where he'd shown her a small cave weeks before. He'd stocked it with emergency supplies, water, blankets, some dried food, explaining through gestures that sandstorms could last for days in these parts. They barely made it inside before the storm engulfed everything. The howling wind sounded like a living thing, furious and hungry. Sand found its way through every tiny gap in the rocks, stinging exposed skin and making breathing difficult even with the bandanas Colt had insisted they wear over their faces. He lit a small fire near the cave entrance, the smoke helping to keep the worst of the sand at bay. In the flickering light, they huddled under the blankets, sitting close for warmth as the temperature dropped with nightfall. Buck pressed against Eliza's other side, the dog's usual wariness forgotten in the face of nature's fury. Hours passed. The storm showed no signs of abating. Eliza found herself acutely aware of Colt's presence, the warmth radiating from his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his hand occasionally checked to ensure the blanket covered her shoulders. She'd been living in his cabin for over a month now, but they'd maintained a careful distance, an unspoken boundary born of propriety and mutual wariness. Now, forced into this small space with the world raging outside, that distance seemed to collapse. She turned to look at him and found his dark eyes already on her, reflecting the firelight. There was something in his gaze she hadn't seen before, or perhaps hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge. "Are you afraid?" she asked, though she suspected he'd weathered far worse storms than this. He shook his head slowly, but his hand found hers under the blanket. A question in the gentle pressure of his fingers. She turned her palm up, interlacing their fingers, and felt him exhale, a soft sound barely audible above the wind. "I used to be afraid of everything," Eliza confessed. "Afraid of disappointing my parents, afraid of becoming a spinster, afraid of the townspeople's whispers. Then my worst fears came true, and I discovered something strange. Once you've lost everything you're afraid of losing, there's a kind of freedom in it." Colt squeezed her hand, understanding in that simple gesture. With his free hand, he touched his throat, then placed that hand over his heart, his meaning clear. He too had lost something essential and found a different life in its absence. "How did it happen?" she asked softly. "Your voice." He hesitated, then released her hand to pull down the collar of his shirt. The scar she'd glimpsed before was fully visible now, a vicious line across his throat, clearly made by a blade, but there were other marks too, older and more deliberate, as if someone had taken their time. Eliza's breath caught. She'd seen enough brandings on cattle to recognize the deliberate nature of those wounds. Someone had tortured him. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers barely grazing the damaged skin. Colt went very still, but didn't pull away. His eyes closed as her touch traced the evidence of old pain, gentle as a butterfly's wing. "Who did this to you?" she whispered. He opened his eyes, caught her hand in his, and pressed it flat against his chest where she could feel his heart racing. Then he shook his head. "Not can't tell you, she understood, but won't. Some stories were too heavy to share, even in silence." "I understand," she said, and meant it. "We all have scars. Some are just more visible than others." Something shifted in his expression then. He raised his free hand to her face, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. The gesture was so tender it made her chest ache. The firelight flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their small shelter, another kind of storm was building. Eliza could feel it in the charged air between them, in the way Colt's thumb lingered on her cheek, in her own quickened breathing. "Colt," she whispered, not sure what she was asking. He leaned closer, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his lips found hers in a kiss that was nothing like the chaste pecks she'd exchanged with Thomas years ago. This was fire and desperation, hunger and healing all at once. His hand tangled in her hair, loosened from its usual practical braid, while hers gripped his shirt as if he might disappear. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Eliza saw her own wonder reflected in his eyes. He touched his lips, then hers, a question in the gesture. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes." The second kiss was deeper, more certain. Colt pulled her onto his lap, the blanket falling away unheeded. His hands framed her face like she was something precious, something worth protecting. Eliza had never felt wanted like this, not for what she could provide or produce, but simply for herself. The storm outside seemed to echo the tempest in her blood. Every touch was a revelation, every kiss a confession. When Colt's lips found the sensitive spot where her neck met her shoulder, she gasped, fingers digging into his shoulders. He pulled back immediately, concern written across his features. Always careful, always checking. It made her heart ache with a tenderness she'd never expected to feel. "I'm not fragile," she told him, voice fierce. "I won't break." His smile was rare and transformative, lighting up his usually solemn features. Then he was kissing her again, less carefully this time, letting her feel the depth of his desire. They made a bed of blankets on the sandy cave floor, the fire burning low but steady. In the dim light, they came together with a passion that surprised them both. There was nothing practiced or polished about it, just two damaged souls finding solace in each other's arms. Colt was gentle despite his strength, reverent in his touch. He traced the curves of her body like he was memorizing them, his calloused hands raising goosebumps on her skin. When she gasped his name, he caught the sound with his mouth, swallowing her cries as they moved together in ancient rhythm. Afterward, they lay entwined, skin cooling in the desert night. Colt pulled the blanket over them, his arm a protective band around her waist. Eliza traced lazy patterns on his chest, feeling more at peace than she had in years. "I was told I could never be a proper wife," she said quietly. "That without children, I had no value. But this, what we just shared, it had nothing to do with creating life. Did it? It was just about us, about connection and desire, and something I don't quite have words for." Colt pressed a kiss to her forehead, his agreement clear in the gesture. He understood what she meant, that intimacy could exist for its own sake, that a woman's worth wasn't tied to her fertility, that two people could come together simply because they wanted each other. The storm began to die down near dawn. They dressed slowly, reluctant to break the spell of the night, but as they prepared to leave the cave, Eliza caught Colt's arm. "I don't regret it," she said firmly. "Not one moment. But I need to know, was this just shelter from the storm? Or—" He silenced her with a kiss, soft but certain. When he pulled back, he took her hand and placed it over his heart again, then pointed to her and back to himself. "Together," the gesture said. "We're together now." They emerged from the cave to find the world transformed. Sand had sculpted new patterns on the rocks, and the air was crystal clear in the way it only was after a storm. The sun painted the mountains in shades of rose and gold. A new day beginning. Back at the cabin, they fell into bed properly, exhausted from the night's adventures. But when Eliza woke hours later, she found Colt watching her with soft eyes, his hands smoothing her tangled hair. "Good morning," she whispered, suddenly shy despite everything they'd shared. He smiled and reached for the paper and charcoal on the bedside table. In his careful script, he wrote, "Every morning is good now." She laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to surprise them both. "You're a romantic under all that stoicism, aren't you?" He shrugged, but his eyes danced with humor. Then he wrote again, "Only for you." Over the following days, they settled into a new rhythm. The careful distance was gone, replaced by casual touches and stolen kisses. Eliza would pause in her gardening to find Colt watching her with heat in his eyes. He would come up behind her while she cooked, arms wrapping around her waist, lips finding that spot on her neck that made her knees weak. At night, they came together with increasing passion and knowledge of each other's desires. Eliza discovered she was far more sensual than she'd ever imagined, her body responding to Colt's touch like drought-stressed earth to rain. He seemed determined to worship every inch of her, to prove without words that she was everything a woman should be. But it was the quiet moments she treasured most. The way he'd braid her hair with surprising skill. How he'd chosen the best pieces of meat for her plate without seeming to. The pride in his eyes when she mastered loading and firing his spare pistol. "I love you," she told him one evening as they sat watching the sunset from the cabin's porch. The words came easily, without the fear that had once governed every aspect of her life. "I don't need you to say it back. I just needed you to know." Colt set down the piece of wood he'd been whittling and turned to face her fully. He touched his chest, then made a gesture she'd never seen before, his fist against his heart, then opening like a flower toward her. Then he mouthed the words, exaggerated so she could read his lips. "I love you too." Tears pricked her eyes, but they were tears of happiness now. She'd been told she was worthless, broken, useless, but here in this harsh, beautiful land, with a man who spoke volumes in silence, she'd found her worth had nothing to do with what her body could or couldn't produce. She was valuable because she was strong, because she was kind, because she could make Colt smile with just a look. She was valuable because she was Eliza, and that was enough. The contract arrived on a crisp November morning, delivered by a weather-beaten rider who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else than at Colt McCrae's isolated cabin. Eliza watched from the garden as Colt read the document, his expression growing more troubled with each line. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her basket of late vegetables. He handed her the paper. The letterhead read Southwestern Freight Company, and the offer was substantial. $500 to guard a supply train from Cedar Falls to Fort Sumner, straight through Comanche territory. It was more money than most men saw in a year, but the route was notorious for attacks. "You're going to take it," Eliza said. It wasn't a question. She'd learned to read Colt's expressions over the past months, and she recognized the mixture of duty and necessity in his eyes. Winter was coming, and while they'd managed well enough, extra funds would mean proper supplies, ammunition, perhaps even improvements to the cabin. He nodded slowly, then wrote on his slate, "Too dangerous for you to stay here alone. Come with me." To Comanche territory. Eliza's heart raced, but not entirely from fear. "I don't know anything about traveling through hostile lands." Colt's lips quirked in what passed for a smile. He gestured to himself, then wrote, "I'll teach you." The next week was intense. Colt instructed her in skills she'd never imagined needing: how to read tracks in the dust, find water in seemingly barren land, load and fire a rifle quickly and accurately. He taught her to ride astride instead of side saddle, ignoring her initial protests about propriety. "Propriety won't stop a bullet," he wrote when she complained about the split skirt he'd procured for her. Eliza threw herself into the lessons with determination. Each bruise from the rifle's kick, each ache from hours in the saddle, felt like armor she was building against the world's cruelties. She was no longer the soft town woman who'd fled in a wedding dress. The desert was remaking her, with Colt as her guide. They joined the supply train at Cedar Falls on a cold December morning. The wagon master, a grizzled veteran named Josiah Wade, looked Eliza up and down with obvious skepticism. "This ain't no pleasure trip, McCrae," he said, deliberately ignoring Colt's inability to respond verbally. "We can't be slowing down for no woman." Eliza stepped forward before Colt could react. "I can ride 12 hours without complaint, shoot a jackrabbit at 50 yards, and make biscuits over a campfire that won't break your teeth." "Can you?" Several of the teamsters chuckled. Wade's eyes narrowed, but she saw a glimmer of respect there. "We'll see, won't we?" The caravan consisted of 15 wagons loaded with supplies for the fort ammunition, medical supplies, blankets, and food staples. 20 men served as guards and drivers. Rough sorts who eyed Eliza with expressions ranging from curiosity to hunger. Colt's presence at her side, hand resting casually on his Colt .45, discouraged any approaches. The first days passed peacefully enough. Eliza rode alongside the wagons, her rifle across her saddle, alert for any sign of trouble. The teamsters gradually accepted her presence, especially after she proved Wade wrong about the biscuits. Even hardened men appreciated good food on the trail. At night, she and Colt made camp slightly apart from the others. He'd shown her how to position their bedrolls for defense, always with clear sight lines and their horses picketed close. They maintained separate beds for appearance's sake, though Eliza longed for his warmth during the cold desert nights. On the fourth night, she woke to find Colt gone from his bedroll. Alarmed, she reached for her rifle, then saw him standing guard at the edge of their camp, silhouetted against the stars. She joined him, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders. "Can't sleep?" she whispered. He pointed to the distant hills, barely visible in the moonlight. His tension was palpable. Something was out there. The attack came at dawn. Eliza woke to the thunder of hooves and war cries that made her blood freeze. Comanche warriors descended from the hills like demons, firing arrows and rifles with deadly accuracy. "Circle the wagons," Wade bellowed, but Colt was already moving, pulling Eliza behind cover as bullets whined overhead. The battle was chaos. Dust and gun smoke filled the air, making it hard to see friend from foe. Eliza found herself firing and reloading with mechanical precision, Colt's training overriding her terror. She saw a warrior charging their position and dropped him with a shot that surprised her with its accuracy. Then Colt grunted and stumbled, crimson blooming across his shirt. He'd thrown himself between her and a Comanche who'd gotten too close, taking an arrow meant for her. The warrior raised his tomahawk for a killing blow, but Eliza's rifle spoke first, dropping him mere feet away. "Colt!" She dragged him behind a wagon wheel, hands shaking as she examined the wound. The arrow had pierced his shoulder, missing vital organs but bleeding heavily. He gripped her wrist, eyes fierce, and pointed to her rifle. The message was clear. Keep fighting. She wanted to weep, to rage at him for his sacrifice, but there was no time. She reloaded and returned to the fight, standing over his body like an avenging angel. The attack lasted less than an hour, though it felt like eternity. When the surviving Comanche finally retreated, 7 teamsters lay dead or dying. The medicine wagon had been hit, supplies scattered and destroyed. Eliza knelt by Colt, who was pale but conscious. The arrow needed to come out, but she'd never done anything like that before. Her hands trembled as she gripped the shaft. "I can help," a voice said. One of the teamsters, a former army medic named Samuel, knelt beside them. "But it's going to hurt like hell." Colt nodded, then looked at Eliza. He reached up with his good hand and touched her face, thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Then he gripped a piece of leather Samuel offered and bit down hard. Eliza held Colt's hand as Samuel worked. Feeling his body tense with agony, he couldn't voice. When the arrow came free, Colt's grip nearly broke her fingers, but she didn't let go. She helped clean and bandage the wound with torn strips from her petticoat, whispering reassurances and love words he couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. That night, Wade approached their camp. "Your woman fought like a wildcat," he told Colt. "Saved Peterson's life when those savages flanked us. Never seen anything like it from a lady." "I'm no lady," Eliza said firmly. "Ladies don't survive out here." Wade studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "No, I reckon they don't." He looked at Colt. "She's a keeper. McCrae. Man'd be a fool to let her go." They made Fort Sumner 3 days later, Colt weak but improving. The commander paid the promised fee plus a bonus for their losses. Several soldiers tried to court Eliza during their brief stay, drawn by her unusual combination of beauty and steel. She rebuffed them all with a politeness that still managed to convey she'd shoot them if they persisted. In the fort's trading post, she used some of their earnings to buy medical supplies, ammunition, and, surprising Colt, a simple gold band. "People make assumptions," she explained that night in their rented room. the first real bed they'd shared in weeks. This might prevent some of them. Colt took the ring, studied it, then slid it onto her finger with deliberate ceremony. He kissed her hand, then her lips, a promise without words. They might not be married in the eyes of law or God, but they belonged to each other in ways that mattered more. The journey back was quieter but no less dangerous. Winter had arrived in earnest, bringing freezing nights and the threat of snow in the high passes. Colt's wound made him vulnerable, though he tried to hide it. Eliza took on more of the watch duties, pride warring with fear each time she stood guard while he slept. One morning, she woke to find him burning with fever. They were still 2 days from home, camped in a narrow canyon that offered shelter from the wind. She did everything Samuel had taught her, cleaning the wound, forcing water and willow bark tea down his throat, keeping him warm while the fever raged. That night, delirious. Colt spoke for the first time since she'd known him. His voice was a broken whisper, damaged vocal cords producing only fragments of words. But she understood enough. He called her name, begged someone named Marcus to forgive him, relived some battles she could only imagine. "I'm here," she whispered, holding him close. "You're safe. I won't let anything happen to you." The fever broke near dawn. Colt woke weak but lucid, touching his throat in wonder and confusion. He tried to speak again but produced only a painful rasp. Eliza pressed fingers to his lips. "Don't," she said. "I heard everything I needed to. You called my name. That's all that matters." They made it home as the first snow began to fall, transforming the desert landscape into something alien and beautiful. Buck greeted them with enthusiastic limping, as if he'd feared they'd never return. That night, warm and safe in their bed, Eliza traced the new scar on Colt's shoulder, another mark on his battered body, another reminder of how fragile life was out here. "You saved me," she said. "Took an arrow meant for me." He caught her hand, pressed it to his heart, then pointed to her. "You saved me too," the gesture said, and not just from the fever or the Comanche. She'd saved him from the silence of his isolation, from the belief that his wounds made him less than whole. "We save each other," Eliza agreed. "That's what partners do." The gold band on her finger caught the firelight as she pulled him close. They'd tested their bond in blood and fire, in fever and fear. They'd discovered that she was far stronger than anyone in Mercy's Bend had imagined, and that together they could face whatever the harsh land threw at them. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow and drawing them back to civilization for supplies. Eliza had resisted the trip to Mercy's Bend, but Colt insisted. They needed seed for planting, ammunition, fabric, and dozen other necessities that only the town could provide. Besides, he wrote, it had been months. Perhaps memories had faded. They rode in quietly on a Tuesday morning, Eliza wearing practical trail clothes that bore no resemblance to the desperate bride who'd fled 8 months earlier. Her hair was braided simply, her face sun-bronzed, the rifle across her saddle as natural as breathing. The gold band on her finger caught the light. The first whispers started at the general store. Mrs. Pritchard, who'd attended that disastrous wedding, nearly dropped her purchases when she recognized Eliza. By the time they reached the hotel, half the town seemed to be watching from doorways and windows. "Let them look," Eliza murmured to Colt as they secured a room. "I'm not the same woman they cast out, but the past has ways of reaching forward." As they ate dinner in the hotel dining room, a familiar voice made Eliza's blood chill. "Well, well, the barren bride returns." Nathan Blackwell stood beside their table, prosperous in a new suit that spoke of recent success. Behind him were 2 men who looked like hired muscle rather than cowboys. Colt's hand moved toward his gun, but Eliza touched his wrist, stilling him. She looked up at Nathan with cool composure. "Mr. Blackwell, I'd say it's a pleasure, but my mother taught me not to lie." His face flushed. "Sharp tongue for damaged goods. Though I suppose you've found your level, taking up with a mute killer. Better a mute killer than a loud coward." she replied evenly. At least he doesn't need to denounce women in church to feel like a man. Nathan's companions chuckled, earning them a glare. His voice dropped. Venomous. You caused me considerable embarrassment, Miss Whitmore. Or is it Mrs. now? Did you trick this poor fool into marrying you? Colt stood slowly, his presence commanding despite his silence. Nathan stepped back involuntarily, then tried to cover his fear with bluster. What's wrong? McCrae, cat got your tongue. He laughed at his own joke. Oh wait, I heard it was a Comanche blade. Must be frustrating, not being able to sweet-talk the ladies, though I suppose this one doesn't require much conversation. The dining room had gone silent. Eliza stood as well, placing herself slightly between the two men. We're leaving, she said quietly. You've had your say. But Nathan grabbed her arm as she passed. Not so fast. You owe me. The rest of his words were cut off as Colt's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling. The hired muscle reached for their guns, but found themselves looking down the barrel of Eliza's rifle, drawn with startling speed. I'd reconsider, she said pleasantly. I've gotten quite good with this over the winter. They backed away, helping Nathan to his feet. His nose was bleeding, his dignity in tatters. This isn't over, he snarled. You'll pay for this, both of you. That night in their hotel room, Eliza tended Colt's split knuckles with gentle efficiency. You shouldn't have hit him, she said, though her heart wasn't in the scolding. He'll cause trouble now. Colt caught her chin, made her look at him. His eyes were fierce, protective. He touched her arm where Nathan had grabbed her, a question in his expression. I'm fine, she assured him. His words don't hurt anymore. I know who I am now. But Colt wasn't satisfied. He wrote quickly. We should leave, tonight. Eliza considered, then shook her head. No, we came for supplies, and we'll get them. I won't run from this town again. The trouble came sooner than expected. They woke before dawn to pounding on their door. The sheriff, a man named Bill Garrett, who'd aged considerably since Eliza had seen him last, stood in the hallway looking embarrassed but determined. Colt McCrae, I'm placing you under arrest for assault. This is ridiculous, Eliza protested. Nathan grabbed me first. Colt was defending. I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore, but Mr. Blackwell filed charges. He's also the new mayor. In case you hadn't heard, my hands are tied. Colt touched her shoulder, calming her. He nodded to the sheriff and held out his hands for the shackles, but his eyes found Eliza's, conveying a message. Don't worry, stay calm. She followed them to the jail, mind racing. Nathan had planned this. She was certain. He wanted Colt out of the way. But why? The answer came that afternoon when Nathan visited her at the hotel. He entered without knocking, his jaw bruised, but his manner triumphant. Your man's looking at serious time, he said conversationally. Assault on a public official. Could be years in territorial prison. What do you want? Eliza asked, though she suspected she knew. Well now, that's the question. Isn't it? Nathan circled her like a predator. You see, I've done quite well for myself since you left. Bought up foreclosed properties, expanded my holdings. I'm a man of influence now. But there's one thing that still bothers me. The embarrassment you caused. That was your doing, not mine. He waved dismissively. Details. The point is, I have a proposition. Spend one night with me. Let me have what should have been mine, and I'll drop the charges. Your mute lover goes free. Eliza felt bile rise in her throat. You're disgusting. I'm practical. You're hardly in a position to refuse, unless you want to see McCrae hang. Oh yes, I know about his past. A few words in the right ears. An assault becomes attempted murder. A known killer attacking the mayor, he'll swing for certain. He moved closer, and Eliza fought not to retreat. Think about it. One night to save his life. Meet me at my ranch tomorrow at sunset, or I'll make sure he never sees daylight again. After he left, Eliza sat on the bed, shaking with rage and fear. She could go to the sheriff, but Garrett was clearly under Nathan's thumb. She could try to break Colt out, but that would make them both fugitives. She needed another way. That evening, she visited Colt in jail. Garrett allowed them privacy. Though she suspected he was listening outside, she couldn't tell Colt about Nathan's proposition. He'd never allow it. Would rather hang than see her sacrifice herself. Instead, she held his hands through the bars and spoke of mundane things, the garden that needed planting, Buck's improving limp, the fox she'd seen near the cabin. All the while, her mind worked frantically. Colt wasn't fooled. He gripped her hands tighter, eyes questioning. She forced a smile. "Everything will be fine. Trust me." That night, Eliza made her preparations. She loaded her rifle and pistol, saddled her horse, and did something that would have shocked her proper former self. She broke into the newspaper office. The Mercy's Bend Gazette was run by Timothy Morrison, an elderly man with a love of whiskey and gossip. His files were extensive and poorly secured. It took Eliza less than an hour to find what she needed. Records of Nathan's property acquisitions, each one preceded by suspicious foreclosures. Letters suggesting bribes and threats. Most damning. Correspondence about a young Mexican woman who disappeared after refusing Nathan's advances. She took everything, along with blank paper and the office stamp. By dawn, she'd written her own story, a full account of Nathan's crimes, including his current attempt to coerce her. She signed it, had it witnessed by the hotel clerk who'd always been kind to her, and made multiple copies. The next day, instead of riding to Nathan's ranch, she distributed her exposé throughout town. She nailed copies to the church door, left them at the saloon, handed them to everyone she met. The scandal was immediate and explosive. Nathan arrived at the jail in a fury, demanding Garrett arrest her for theft and libel. But the crowd that had gathered wasn't on his side anymore. The Mexican woman's family was there, having heard about the letters. So were several farmers who'd lost their lands under suspicious circumstances. "Arrest her?" Old man Hughes spat tobacco juice at Nathan's feet. "Boy, you better worry about your own neck. We don't take kindly to men who force themselves on women in these parts." The situation escalated quickly. Nathan's hired muscle abandoned him when the crowd turned ugly. Garrett, seeing which way the wind was blowing, suddenly remembered his duty to investigate the allegations. By evening, it was Nathan in a cell. Not Colt. The territorial marshal had been summoned to investigate corruption charges. Nathan's house of cards was collapsing spectacularly. When Colt was released, he found Eliza waiting outside the jail, exhausted but victorious. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he finally loosened his grip, his eyes were full of questions. "I'll explain everything," she promised. "But first, let's go home." They left Mercy's Bend that night, but not in flight. This time, Eliza rode with her head high, knowing she'd faced her past and won. The townspeople who'd once whispered about the barren bride now spoke of her courage in exposing a corrupt man. At their cabin, safe under familiar stars, Eliza told Colt everything. His face darkened when she revealed Nathan's proposition, his fists clenching with suppressed violence. "I would never have done it," she assured him. "I just needed him to believe I might, to buy time to find another way." Colt wrote slowly, his hand still unsteady with emotion. "You're extraordinary." "No," Eliza corrected, curling into his embrace. "I'm just not afraid anymore. This place, you, our life here, it's taught me my own strength. Nathan thought he could use my shame against me, but I have no shame anymore. I know my worth." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire die to embers. Finally, Colt wrote again. "Marry me." Eliza looked at him in surprise. "We already have this," she said, touching her ring. "We don't need—" He put his finger to her lips, then wrote, "Not for them, for us, properly." Her eyes filled with tears. After everything, after being rejected at the altar, declared worthless, nearly sold to save the man she loved, he was offering her what she'd thought she'd never have, a true wedding, born of love rather than duty or desperation. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Colt's smile was radiant, transforming his usually stern features. He kissed her deeply, pouring all the words he couldn't say into the embrace. When they finally broke apart, Eliza was laughing and crying simultaneously. "Though I should warn you," she said, wiping her eyes, "I'm still barren. That hasn't changed." Colt's response was to sweep her into his arms and carry her inside, his meaning clear. She was all he wanted, all he would ever need. Her worth to him had nothing to do with children and everything to do with the remarkable woman she'd become. The news of Nathan Blackwell's return reached them on a sweltering July afternoon. Jake Patterson, a trader who occasionally stopped by their cabin, brought word that Nathan had been released after serving only 3 months. Worse, he'd somehow retained enough influence to get himself appointed as the new federal magistrate for the territory. "Man's got connections back east," Jake explained, accepting the cup of water Eliza offered. "His cousin's a senator or some such. Pulled strings, got him out early and into a position of power. He's been making noise about cleaning up the lawless elements in the territory." Colt and Eliza exchanged glances. They both knew who those lawless elements would include. "There's more," Jake continued reluctantly. "He's been asking about you two, where you're living, if anyone's seen you, offering good money for information." After Jake left, Eliza found Colt standing at the edge of their property, staring out at the desert with tense shoulders. She slipped her hand into his, feeling the tremor of suppressed anger in his grip. "We knew this might happen," she said quietly. "Men like Nathan don't accept defeat easily." Colt nodded, then wrote on the small slate he carried, "Should send you away, safe." "No," her voice was firm. "We've had this discussion. I'm not leaving you, not for Nathan Blackwell or anyone else." The next weeks passed in watchful tension. Colt increased their security, setting up warning systems on the approaches to their cabin. He taught Eliza new defensive tactics, grimmer ones designed for close combat. She learned without complaint, understanding the necessity. The attack came on a moonless night in August. Buck's growling woke them moments before the first shot shattered their window. Colt rolled from bed, pulling Eliza down with him as bullets peppered the walls where they'd been lying. "How many?" Eliza whispered, already reaching for her rifle. Colt held up 5 fingers, maybe 6. Too many for a direct confrontation. He pointed to the root cellar they'd reinforced for exactly this possibility. Eliza shook her head. "I'm not hiding while you fight alone." His eyes flashed with frustration, but there was no time to argue. Someone was trying to break down their reinforced door. Colt positioned himself at the window while Eliza took the side entrance, both armed and ready. The battle was fierce but brief. The attackers hadn't expected such organized resistance. Eliza dropped 2 men trying to flank them, her shots precise despite her racing heart. Colt's rifle spoke with deadly authority, keeping the main force pinned down. Then she heard it, the splash of liquid against wood, the acrid smell of kerosene. They were trying to burn them out. "Colt!" She pointed to the smoke beginning to curl under the door. His face went grim. He gestured for her to follow him to the back exit they'd installed for emergencies. They burst out together, surprising the man stationed there. Colt's knife flashed in the darkness, silent and lethal. They ran for the rocks, bullets whining past, the cabin beginning to blaze behind them. In the shelter of a boulder cluster, they made their stand. The remaining attackers, silhouetted by the burning cabin, made easy targets. When the shooting finally stopped, 4 men lay dead. 2 had fled, and their home was a pillar of flame against the night sky. Eliza stared at the destruction, tears streaming down her face. Everything they'd built, all their small possessions and memories, turning to ash. Colt pulled her against him, his own grief evident in the rigid set of his shoulders. But there was no time to mourn. By dawn, they were on the trail, having salvaged what little they could. Buck limped alongside, singed but alive. They needed to disappear, to find somewhere Nathan's reach couldn't extend. They rode hard for 3 days, stopping only when exhaustion demanded it. On the 4th day, they reached the abandoned mining camp Colt remembered from his scouting days. It wasn't much, a few derelict buildings clinging to a mountainside. But it was shelter. That night, as they huddled in what had once been the foreman's office. Eliza finally broke down. The loss of their home, the constant running, the weight of being hunted, it all crashed over her at once. "I'm tired," she sobbed against Colt's chest. "So tired of being afraid, of looking over our shoulders. When does it end?" Colt held her, rocking slightly, his own tears silent against her hair. When her storm passed, he wrote by flickering candlelight, "End this, my way." She knew what he meant. The old way, the gunfighter's way. Hunt or be hunted. You're not that man anymore. His smile was sad as he wrote. Always was. Just found peace for a while. With you. Then I'm going with you. He shook his head vehemently, but she caught his hands. "Listen to me. Nathan wants me as much as you. This is my fight too. We do this together, or not at all." They planned carefully. Nathan had surrounded himself with guards and legal protection, but every man had vulnerabilities. They needed information, allies, a way to draw him out of his fortress of political power. The answer came from an unexpected source, Maria Delgado, sister to the woman who'd disappeared after refusing Nathan. Found them in the mining camp. How she'd tracked them, Eliza never learned, but desperation had made her resourceful. "I know you seek justice against Nathan Blackwell," Maria said without preamble. "So do I. My sister Rosa. Her body was found. I have proof he killed her. But no lawman will listen to a Mexican woman's accusations against a federal magistrate." She produced letters, Rosa's diary, witness accounts, evidence that Nathan had assaulted and murdered Rosa when she threatened to expose his advances. It was damning, but as Maria said, who would believe them? "We make them believe," Eliza said firmly. "But we need to get this evidence to someone with power, someone Nathan can't buy or intimidate." They hatched a plan that required split-second timing and considerable risk. There was a federal judge named Harrison coming through the territory, a man with a reputation for strict honesty. If they could get the evidence to him, along with witnesses to Nathan's recent crimes, the plan required bait. Nathan wanted Eliza, had always wanted her. She would be the lure to draw him out of safety. Colt's opposition was violent, though silent. He paced their hideout like a caged wolf, occasionally stopping to write increasingly desperate arguments. But Eliza stood firm. "He destroyed our home," she said. "He'll keep coming until one of us is dead. This is our chance to end it legally, without becoming the killers he claims we are." The trap was set for a Friday evening. Eliza sent word through channels she knew Nathan monitored, offering to meet him at the old mission outside town. She'd come alone, she promised, ready to negotiate terms for Colt's safety. Nathan took the bait, his arrogance overcoming caution. He arrived with only 2 guards, confident in his power over a desperate woman. Eliza waited in the mission courtyard, outwardly calm though her heart hammered. Nathan dismissed his guards to the perimeter, wanting privacy for what he assumed would be her surrender. "You look well for a woman on the run," he said, circling her with predatory satisfaction. "Though I must say, the hardship suits you. You're even lovelier than before." "I'm here to make a deal," Eliza said steadily. "Call off your hunt for Colt, and I'll comply with your wishes." Nathan laughed. "Oh, my dear, you're hardly in a position to negotiate. Your man is probably dead already. I sent another team after him while you've been playing the sacrificial lamb." Fear spiked through her, but she held her ground. "Then you've wasted your money. Colt's long gone, headed for Mexico. I'm all you're getting." He moved closer, reaching out to touch her face. "Well then, I suppose I'll have to make do with—" The doors burst open. Federal marshals flooded in, guns drawn. Judge Harrison himself entered, along with Maria and several other witnesses who'd been hidden in the mission's alcoves. Listening to every damning word, Nathan's face went white. "This is entrapment. I'll have your badges for this." "I think not," Judge Harrison said coldly. "We have your full confession to murder, attempted murder, and assault, plus the evidence Miss Delgado provided. You're finished." Blackwell. As the marshals dragged Nathan away, he spotted Colt emerging from the shadows. The mute gunfighter's expression was one of grim satisfaction. "You?" Nathan snarled. "You're supposed to be running for Mexico." Colt smiled, a rare sight that transformed his face. He pulled Eliza against him, kissing her thoroughly in full view of everyone. The message was clear. They'd played Nathan perfectly, using his arrogance and obsession against him. That night, in a hotel room paid for by the grateful federal authorities, Eliza and Colt held each other close. The danger had passed. Their enemy vanquished through law rather than lead. They could rebuild, start fresh without shadows haunting their steps. "I'm sorry about the cabin," Eliza murmured against his chest. "All our things, our memories." Colt tilted her chin up, making her meet his eyes. He touched her ring, then his heart, then gestured around them. The meaning was clear. Home wasn't a place, but what they carried with them. Their love, their bond, their shared strength. "You're right," she whispered. "We'll build another home, a better one. And this time, no one will drive us from it." He kissed her then, deep and promising, sealing their new beginning. Outside, thunder rolled across the desert, bringing the promise of rain to wash the land clean. It seemed fitting, a storm passing, leaving clear skies ahead. The morning after Nathan's arrest, Colt stood before Judge Harrison in the federal courthouse, his expression resolute despite the gravity of the moment. Eliza sat in the gallery, hands clenched in her lap as the judge reviewed the wanted notices that still carried Colt's name. "Mr. McCrae," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "You stand accused of the murder of one Marcus Webb and 3 other men in the summer of 1885. What say you to these charges?" Colt looked to his appointed defender, a young lawyer named Thomas Brennan who'd volunteered for the case. Brennan stood, clearing his throat nervously. "Your Honor, my client cannot speak due to injuries sustained during torture by the very men he's accused of killing. However, we have new evidence and witnesses that will prove Mr. McCrae acted in self-defense." What followed was a revelation that left even Eliza stunned. Witnesses came forward, men who'd stayed silent for years out of fear. They testified that Marcus Webb had been running a gang of claim jumpers and murderers, using his position as a territorial deputy to cover his crimes. Colt had discovered the scheme and tried to report it, only to be betrayed by the very man he'd trusted. An old prospector named Elijah Morse took the stand, his weathered face grim with remembered horror. "They strung McCrae up in the old mine shaft," he testified. Webb wanted to know where McCrae had hidden the evidence he'd gathered. When Colt wouldn't talk, Webb took a knife to his throat, said he'd carved the words out of him one way or another. Eliza pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting nausea. She'd known Colt had been tortured, but hearing the details was almost unbearable. "McCrae managed to break free," Morse continued. "Half dead, bleeding something awful. Webb and his men came after him. It was them or him, Your Honor. Any man would have done the same." More witnesses followed. A doctor who'd treated Colt's wounds and urged him to flee rather than face Webb's corrupted justice. A woman whose husband had been murdered by Webb's gang, grateful that someone had finally stopped them. Even a former member of the gang, granted immunity for his testimony, confirmed that Colt had killed only in desperate self-defense. But the most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source. Maria Delgado produced a letter from her sister Rosa, written days before her death, mentioning that she'd overheard Nathan Blackwell discussing the McCrae problem with someone who matched Webb's description. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Judge Harrison deliberated for less than an hour. When he returned, his verdict was clear. In light of the evidence presented, and considering the corruption that appears to have infected the territorial justice system at that time, I find that Colt McCrae acted in justifiable self-defense. All charges are hereby dismissed, and his record is to be cleared. Eliza flew from her seat, rushing into Colt's arms as the courtroom erupted in applause. He held her tightly, his body trembling with the release of years of tension. Free, he was finally, truly free. That evening, in their hotel room, Colt sat at the small desk writing steadily, Eliza watched from the bed, recognizing the intensity in his movements. When he finally finished, he handed her several pages covered in his careful script. It was his story, the full truth he'd never been able to tell. How he'd joined Webb's outfit believing they were legitimate lawmen. How he'd slowly realized the truth and gathered evidence. The night Webb had discovered his investigation and the torture that followed. His desperate escape and the running battle that had left 4 men dead and him voiceless. But the last page wasn't about the past. It was about the future, their future. He wrote of wanting to use the reward money from Nathan's capture to buy land. To build not just a cabin, but a real home. To raise horses, maybe run some cattle. To live openly, without fear or shame. And at the bottom, in larger letters, marry me properly, in a church, with witnesses. Let me give you the wedding you deserve. Eliza was crying by the time she finished reading. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married 2 weeks later in the small chapel at San Miguel Mission. It was nothing like her first wedding. No crowds of curious townspeople, no elaborate dress, no sense of doom. Instead, there was warmth and joy and the presence of true friends. Maria Delgado stood as her witness. Having become a dear friend through their shared trials, Judge Harrison himself gave Eliza away, joking that it was the least he could do after putting them through such an ordeal. Even gruff Jake Patterson cleaned up for the occasion, claiming someone had to make sure Colt didn't get cold feet. Eliza wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, with wildflowers woven into her hair, when she walked down the aisle. Colt's face lit up with such pure love that several of the tough frontiersmen in attendance had to clear their throats and look away. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When it came time for vows, Colt had prepared something special. He handed the priest a written statement, which Father Miguel read aloud in accented English. Eliza, you gave me back my life when I thought I had nothing left to live for. You saw past my silence to the man beneath. You stood by me when the world was against us. I promised to protect you, cherish you, and love you with every breath in my body for all the days of our lives. Eliza could barely speak her own vows through her tears, but her voice was strong when she declared, I do. The celebration afterward was held in the mission's courtyard, with the Mexican musicians playing lively tunes and tables groaning with food. Colt had somehow learned to dance, leading Eliza through a waltz with surprising grace. When she laughed in delight, he spun her until her skirts flew, both of them giddy with happiness. As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the newlyweds prepared to leave for their honeymoon, a week in Santa Fe, in a real hotel with a real bed and no one hunting them. But first, there was one more surprise. Thomas Brennan approached with legal documents. Mr. and Mrs. McCrae, I've taken the liberty of filing the homestead claim you requested, 160 acres in the valley you selected, with water rights and everything properly recorded. You can start building whenever you're ready. Colt shook the lawyer's hand gratefully while Eliza hugged him, making the young man blush. They had land, legally theirs, where no one could drive them away. The week in Santa Fe was everything a honeymoon should be. They spent lazy mornings in bed, explored the old city in the afternoons, and dined in restaurants where no one knew their story. Colt bought Eliza small gifts, a silver brush for her hair, a leather-bound journal, a cameo brooch that reminded him of her strength and beauty. On their last night, as they sat on their hotel balcony watching the stars, Eliza made her own confession. I need to tell you something, she began hesitantly, about what the doctor said, about my being barren. I've been thinking, what if he was wrong? Or what if things could change? I don't want you to have false hope, but... Colt pressed his finger to her lips, then wrote on the small slate he still carried, Don't need children, only need you. I know, she said softly, and that's enough for me too. But if somehow, someday, a miracle happened, would you want that? His answer was to pull her into his lap, holding her close as he nodded against her hair. If it happened, they would rejoice. If it didn't, they would still be complete. They returned to their land to find that their friends had been busy. A foundation had been laid for their new home, timber stacked and ready. Maria had planted a small garden with herbs and vegetables. Even Buck, who'd been staying with Jake, seemed eager to start their new life, running in circles despite his limp. As they stood surveying their future, Eliza felt a deep contentment settle into her bones. The journey from that humiliating day in Mercy's Bend to this moment had been long and painful, but it had brought her to exactly where she belonged. "No more running," she said, threading her fingers through Colt's. "No more hiding. Just building, growing, living." He squeezed her hand, then pointed to the eastern horizon where the sun was rising, painting their valley in shades of promise. A new day, a new beginning, and all the time in the world to make their dreams real. They set to work with willing hearts, side by side as they'd always been. The mute gunslinger and the woman once called barren, proving that sometimes the most beautiful lives grow from the harshest ground. 3 years had passed since their wedding at San Miguel Mission. The small cabin had grown into a proper homestead with a main house, barn, and flourishing gardens that stretched toward the creek. Eliza stood on the porch she'd helped build, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of copper and gold. One hand pressed unconsciously to her stomach. It had been 2 months since she'd first suspected. 2 months of secret hope and terror, of watching for signs while afraid to believe. The nausea that came with mourning, the tenderness in her breasts, the absence of her monthly courses, all pointed to something Dr. Morrison had declared impossible. But it was the quickening she'd felt that morning, like butterfly wings against her womb, that had finally convinced her. Life grew within her, miraculous, impossible, real. Colt found her there as darkness fell, his arms wrapping around her from behind in their evening ritual. She leaned back against his solid warmth, gathering courage for what she needed to say. "I have something to tell you," she began, then laughed shakily. "I've been trying to find the words all day, which is ironic, given—" He turned her in his arms, concern creasing his weathered features. His hands framed her face, thumbs brushing her cheekbones in question. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. Colt went absolutely still. His eyes searched hers, looking for the jest, the mistake, finding neither. His gaze dropped to her still flat stomach, then back to her face. His mouth opened, closed, no sound emerging from his damaged throat, but his expression spoke volumes. "I know," Eliza said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "They said it was impossible, but I felt the baby move. Colt, there's life inside me, our child." His knees gave out. The strongest man she knew sank to the porch boards, pressing his face against her stomach with shaking shoulders. She felt his tears through the fabric of her dress, felt the prayers he couldn't voice vibrating against her skin. "Are you happy?" she asked, though she knew the answer. He looked up at her with such raw joy it took her breath away. Rising, he kissed her deeply, then dropped to his knees again to kiss her stomach, her hands, her wedding ring. His celebration was silent but profound, a dance of pure elation that made her laugh through her tears. That night, he was almost afraid to touch her, as if she'd become glass. Eliza had to pull him close, assuring him she wouldn't break. They made love tenderly, Colt's hands reverent on her changing body, his eyes never leaving hers. Afterward, he lit every lamp in the house and began writing. Pages and pages poured out, plans for a nursery, names he favored, fears about being a father without a voice to sing lullabies or speak loving words. Eliza read each page, answering his worries with kisses and reassurances. "Your hands will speak love louder than any voice," she told him. "Our child will know your heart." The pregnancy progressed like a season of miracles. Her body, declared barren ground, bloomed with life. Colt treated her like precious porcelain, which both amused and occasionally frustrated her. He would have wrapped her in cotton and forbidden her from lifting anything heavier than a teacup if she'd allowed it. Maria Delgado, now married to Thomas Brennan and living in town, became her confidant and unofficial midwife. She'd helped deliver dozens of babies in her community and promised to be there when Eliza's time came. "This child is already a fighter," Maria said during one visit, feeling the strong movements beneath Eliza's expanded belly. "To exist at all, despite what that fool doctor said, this one will be special." As winter approached, Colt worked tirelessly to prepare. He crafted a beautiful wooden cradle, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. He laid in supplies like they were preparing for a siege: clean linens, medicines, everything Maria said they might need. One snowy evening in December, as Eliza sat knitting tiny garments by the fire, she noticed Colt watching her with an expression of wonder mixed with something else: fear. "What's troubling you?" she asked, setting aside her needles. He hesitated, then wrote, "What if the baby needs things I can't give? What if my silence frightens them?" Eliza held out her hand, drawing him to sit beside her. "Do you remember the first time Buck trusted you enough to eat from your hand? He couldn't speak either, but you understood each other. Love doesn't always need words." The pains began just after Christmas, starting as a dull ache that Eliza tried to ignore. But by evening, they were coming in waves that stole her breath. Colt rode hard through the snow to fetch Maria while Eliza gripped the bedpost, amazed that her body knew this ancient dance despite never learning the steps. The labor was long and difficult. Maria's usual cheerful demeanor grew strained as the hours passed with little progress. Colt paced like a caged animal, occasionally stopping to press cool cloths to Eliza's forehead or hold her hand through the contractions. "The baby's turned wrong," Maria finally admitted. "I need to try to shift them, but it will hurt." Eliza nodded, already exhausted but determined. "Do what you must." What followed was agony that made all her previous trials seem like gentle rain. But through it all, Colt was there, his presence an anchor in the storm of pain. When she screamed, he absorbed the sound into his chest. When she wept, he caught every tear. Finally, as dawn broke across the snow-covered valley, Maria's face lit up. "I can see the head. Push now. Eliza, your baby's coming." With a final effort that felt like it would split her in two, Eliza brought their child into the world. A lusty cry filled the room, the first voice to ring through their home in years. "A daughter," Maria announced, cleaning the squalling infant and placing her on Eliza's chest. Small but perfect, with her father's dark hair and her mother's fighting spirit. Eliza stared down at the miracle in her arms, too overwhelmed for words. Their daughter, their impossible, perfect daughter, opened eyes the color of sage honey and seemed to look right into her soul. Colt's hand shook as he reached out to touch the baby's head, wonder and terror warring in his expression. The infant turned toward his touch, one tiny fist wrapping around his finger with surprising strength. "She knows you," Eliza whispered. "She knows her papa." They named her Hope for what she represented, for what had brought her parents together, for what she promised for the future. Hope McCrae, born of love and defiance of fate itself. The weeks that followed were a blur of adjustment and joy. Colt proved to be a devoted father, walking the floors with Hope when she fussed, changing her with careful efficiency, watching her sleep with an expression of stunned gratitude. He developed his own language with her, gentle touches that meant different things, humming vibrations against her skin that seemed to soothe her better than any lullaby. Hope responded to his silent presence with complete trust, often calming instantly when passed to his steady arms. "You were wrong," Eliza told him one evening as he rocked Hope by the fire. "You're giving her everything she needs." Spring arrived with Hope thriving and Eliza fully recovered. As she worked in her garden, the baby sleeping in a basket nearby, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that devastating day in Mercy's Bend to this moment of quiet contentment, every step had led to exactly where they needed to be. Colt emerged from the barn where he'd been working, crossing to kiss her with familiar passion. His hand settled on her stomach with a gentle question. They'd been blessed once. Perhaps, she agreed, laughing at his eager expression. Though we should probably see how we manage with one miracle before seeking another. That evening, they sat on their porch as they had so many times before. But now, with Hope cradled between them, The baby gazed up at the emerging stars with wide eyes, making soft sounds of wonder. "She's talking to them," Eliza murmured, "telling the stars her baby's secrets." Colt smiled, his arm tightening around his family. He pointed to the brightest star, then to Hope, his meaning clear. She was their light in the darkness, their guide to a future neither had dared imagine. As night settled over their valley, peaceful and complete, Eliza knew that every scar they bore had been worth it. Every moment of pain had led to this, a love that had conquered silence and shame, creating life where none was thought possible. Their story wasn't ending, but beginning anew with each breath their daughter took. The mute gunslinger and the woman once called Baron had found their voices in each other and in the miracle they'd created together. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound carrying across the desert like a benediction. Hope stirred, making a small sound of contentment, and settled deeper into her parents' embrace. Home, heart, and hope, all contained in this moment beneath the vast western sky. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient witnesses to yet another tale of love conquering impossible odds. And in a small homestead carved from wild land, 3 hearts beat as one, proof that sometimes the most beautiful endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Eliza and Colt's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. Where are you listening from today? Please leave a comment below to let me know. I'd love to connect with fellow Western romance enthusiasts from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales of passion and adventure from the American frontier. And share your thoughts about Eliza and Colt's story. Did you see Hope's arrival coming? What was your favorite moment? Let me know in the comments.